So just how prevalent are monopsonies and how and where do monopsonies occur? And these are, like I said, a very special type of situation. So most normal companies or normal industries that you think about probably aren't going to be monopsonies. Some monopsonies historically arose because of geography. Certain industries can only be done in a limited area. So steel in Pittsburgh is an example of this. Some of them occurred because of agglomeration effects. So like textiles in New England in like back in the 1800s. In some of these cases, the employer was so dominant that a company town was appropriate. It actually was what made the most sense. Um, it is so much more rare today, though. So it's not something that we see true monopsonies anymore. One thing is just workers are able to move. Even though migration between states is at its lowest level since World War II, it's much easier today to move. So labor markets are not local or regional in scope. We can find out more about jobs anywhere in the world, anywhere in the country, much easier than we could in the 1800s. It's a radical departure from back then. So if you ended up in a town and you didn't have a lot of skills, so you're working in a coal mine, you didn't have a lot of options to get out there. It's very difficult to find out about another job. Today, much easier to do that. So there's a lot more competition between industries and between firms. We can illustrate this with the paragraphs that we see there on the left side of the screen. So these show the difference between monopsonies with different levels of labor mobility. So in A on the top one, the supply of labor is inelastic. That means that it's not responsive to a change in wages. This is a situation like the 1800s in these company towns, where it's difficult to find a job and then be able to move to a new city. Now, the difference between the competitive wages and the wages under monopsony is the larger of these two graphs in graph A, because it's much more difficult to get a job in a new area, to move from one area to another, to find out about a job in a different area. Now, in graph B, the labor supply is more elastic. And by that, we mean that workers will respond more to changes in wages. This is more similar to the labor market now, where even if labor markets are monopsonistic locally, it's easier for workers to move in and out of those cities. So they can move from one area to another area and find a job much easier than they could before. So in this case, the difference in wages is between the competitive market and between a monopsonistic market is going to be much smaller than we saw when the labor supply was inelastic. Now, we can also think of the government sector as a monopsonist. This is especially true at the local level. So we can think of many cities as being the only employer of a certain type of worker. That maybe something like a firefighter or a school teacher, where there's not options for other employers in the private sector at that level. So there's been a decent amount of research looking for evidence of monopsonistic markets for the local government employees, and they tend to find little evidence. So even though this makes conceptual sense, we don't see monopsonies playing out. Now, why is this the case? Most local services that can be considered monopsonistic are also considered essential services. So they end up with fairly inelastic demand curve. By that, I mean consumers aren't very sensitive to a change or an increase in prices. Basically, citizens don't care as much if their taxes go up. They're still going to want firefighters. They're still going to want schools. So people are going to be willing to pay for it because there's not a lot of substitutes for the service. And like for firefighters, you don't want your house to burn down. So you're going to be willing to pay at least somewhat more for that. So we don't have the traditional monopsonists pushing down on wages. I'm going to skip the market for professional athletes, but I do encourage you to read the section for yourself because it is interesting and can be a good example of seeing a monopsonist market in the world today.